My friends, for many years we have labored under the belief that the spiritual life is achieved by effort, by striving, by pleading, by searching for some distant God who must be persuaded to enter our experience, and yet the entire spiritual path rests upon a paradox so profound that it overturns every one of these concepts. The moment you cease trying to make God act, God begins to reveal himself. The moment you relinquish the strain of human effort, the divine presence that has forever lived within you becomes active as your very life. You see, the great barrier in our journey is not God's unwillingness, nor God's absence, nor God's delay. It is the simple fact that the human self insists upon doing what only the infinite can accomplish. We try to heal ourselves. We try to shape our supply. We try to direct our relationships. We try to improve our own nature through the machinery of the human mind, and in all of this trying, we unconsciously affirm that we are separate beings, attempting to reach a God who is far away. This is the hidden belief behind every effort. But the infinite way was born of a discovery. God is not moved by effort. God is revealed in stillness. God is not reached by struggle. God is present in the quiet recognition that there is nothing to reach. The presence, the activity, the life of God is already where you are. It has been the fabric of your being since before time began. And so, I invite you to consider this paradox deeply. Nothing in your spiritual experience changes through effort, but everything changes the moment you release effort. Not as resignation, not as despair, but as the dawning realization that you are not the one who brings God into action. The Father within does the works. The presence functions of its own accord. The kingdom unfolds from within itself. Your part is simply to stop obstructing that flow with the noise of personal striving. This is the beginning of our journey today, an exploration of that sacred turning point in consciousness. The day you stop trying, and the wondrous activity of God that becomes visible. The instant personal will grows quiet. Let us look more deeply now at this burden that humanity carries, the endless compulsion to try, to struggle, to push against life, as though the responsibility for the universe rested upon our shoulders. Every one of us has, at some time, believed that our safety, our healing, our supply, our very spiritual progress depended upon the intensity of our effort. And yet, my friends, if you will observe closely, you will see that all such effort begins with fear. Fear that God is not present, fear that God will not act, fear that the universe is operating independently of our good. This fear takes subtle forms. It makes us believe we must constantly adjust, solve, improve, overcome. We try to manage our bodies, our finances, our children, our future, as though life were a mechanism that could malfunction unless we monitored it every waking moment. And so the human being becomes weary, not because life is burdensome, but because the false sense of self imagines it must do everything. But hear this, the human mind has no capacity to bring forth harmony. The human will has no capacity to govern the activity of spirit. The personal self, however well-meaning, cannot add a single cubit to its stature through effort. And the tragedy is that in all of this striving, we reinforce the illusion that there is a separate self who must take charge of what is already governed by the infinite. This is the root of the human problem, not sin, not ignorance, not circumstance, but the deep psychological and spiritual conditioning that whispers, If I do not act, nothing will happen. And in obedience to that whisper, the individual plunges into anxiety, trying to fix life from the outside instead of entering the inner stillness where life is already whole. Goldsmith's discovery and the revelation of every mystic who has seen reality is simply this: life is not lived by the human being. Life is lived by God through the human being, and every moment of strain, every moment of mental wrestling is an invisible declaration that we have forgotten this great truth. Therefore, before we can speak of surrender, before we can speak of grace, we must recognize how deeply we have trusted in our personal effort and how sincerely but mistakenly we have attempted to solve spiritual realities with human means. When this recognition dawns, not as guilt but as revelation, the burden begins to dissolve. The heart grows weary of striving, not in defeat, but in readiness for a higher way. There comes a moment in the life of every earnest seeker, a moment not planned, not manufactured, not forced, when the personal will simply begins to grow quiet, not because you have conquered it, not because you have subdued it, but because you have begun to see through it. You begin to realize that all your attempts to direct life have led you only to temporary results and repeated frustrations. And in that realization, there is a gentle softening, an inner surrender that is not resignation but awakening. You discover, perhaps for the first time, that you are not required to run the universe. You are not required to sustain your body, or your supply, or your relationships through personal strength. You begin to sense an unseen activity, a presence that has always been moving quietly beneath the surface of things, waiting only for your silence, your non-interference, your willingness to let it be what it is. This is the turning point, and it is never dramatic. It is never thunderous. It arrives as a stillness, a moment of recognition. I can of my own self do nothing. These were not the words of a helpless man. They were the words of one who saw that the human self has no power apart from the infinite. In that recognition, the personal will dissolves like a shadow in the presence of light. As the will grows quiet, a new form of awareness emerges. You begin to listen not with your ears, but with your inner being. You sense that guidance is not something you create. It is something revealed. Harmony is not something you achieve. It is something already present. Healing is not something you produce. It is something that appears when obstruction is removed. This quieting is the beginning of grace, and you cannot force it, for forcing is the activity of the very will that must become still. Rather, it comes by seeing the futility of striving, the hollowness of personal control, and the peace that arises when you allow life to unfold of its own accord. It is at this point that a profound shift occurs. You stop trying to make God act, and you begin to recognize that God is already acting. You stop trying to generate spiritual experience, and you begin to recognize the presence that has never ceased to be the activity of your being. This turning point is the slender doorway through which the infinite enters your conscious awareness. When the personal will grows quiet, even for a moment, you find yourself entering a new atmosphere of consciousness, an inner chamber where the noise of the world does not penetrate, and where the presence of God becomes a living reality. This is the sacred place of stillness that every mystic has spoken of, not as a metaphor, not as an ideal, but as an actual state of awareness in which the soul communes directly with the infinite. Understand this. True prayer is not thought. True prayer is not words. True prayer is not asking. The most powerful prayer you will ever know is the prayer in which you say nothing at all. It is the prayer of receptivity, the prayer of listening, the prayer in which the mind becomes a transparent instrument through which the spirit announces itself. You see, God does not speak in the language of human words. God speaks in a language of awareness, of inner knowing, of quiet unfolding. And you cannot hear that sacred language while the mind is busy pleading, affirming, visualizing, or attempting to direct the infinite according to its own desires. The human mind must become still, utterly still, before the activity of God can be felt. This inner chamber has been called many things: the secret place of the Most High, the closet, the deep silence, the Holy of Holies. But it is not a physical location. It is an inner posture, a yielding of the mind, a resting of the emotions, a quiet place within where you cease trying to think your way to God and instead allow God to reveal himself. And the beauty of this silence is that it does not require hours of meditation. It requires only a moment in which you turn inward and recognize the presence is here. I need do nothing. That recognition opens the door. That recognition shifts the center of activity from the human to the divine. In this silence, you are not trying to change anything. You are not working on a problem. You are not seeking guidance. You are simply abiding in the awareness of God's presence. And in that abiding, something extraordinary happens. The divine activity begins to function without your thought, without your effort, without your direction. This is the secret of spiritual living. God is always speaking, always revealing, always unfolding. It is only the constant noise of human striving that prevents us from hearing. When you enter the silence, not as escape, but as receptivity, you will discover that the infinite has been conducting the harmony of your life long before you ever knew it. There comes, in the life of every earnest seeker, a day that is unlike any day before it. It may not arrive with fanfare, and it may not come in the way you expect, but it is a day marked by a profound inner shift. It is the day you stop trying, not because you have failed, and not because you have given up, but because something within you has awakened to a deeper truth. The Father within does the work. On that day, you discover that your efforts have never been the source of harmony. Your prayers, your methods, your affirmations, sincere, though they were never produced the action of God. They only reflected your desire to reach what was already present. And in that realization, something releases. The tension goes out of your mind. The strain leaves your heart. You stop attempting to manage life, and you begin to perceive that life is managing itself through you. This moment is grace, and grace is not something you call forth. It is something that becomes visible when obstruction is removed. Grace has always been the activity of your being. Grace has always been the intelligence guiding the universe. But as long as you believe you must make God act, you cannot witness what God is already doing. When trying ceases, fear begins to dissolve, because fear is always born from the belief that you must protect, sustain, or secure yourself. But when you realize that the infinite is the life of your being, fear has no foundation on which to stand. You feel a quiet certainty, a holy assurance that nothing real can be threatened and nothing true can be taken from you. In the moment of grace, you sense that God is not something you reach, but the very essence of your being, revealing itself. You recognize that every breath, every heartbeat, every unfolding event is moving according to a harmony that does not originate in human thought. And you discover a new way of living, You stop directing and begin witnessing. You stop pleading and begin listening. You stop fearing and begin trusting. You stop working from the outside and begin resting in the inner presence that needs no assistance from you. This moment of grace does not come as the result of effort, but as the cessation of effort. When the noise of striving falls silent, the gentle voice of the infinite is heard. And in that hearing, everything changes, not because you have changed conditions, but because you have awakened to the one who governs them all. This is the day you stop trying. This is the day God becomes visible, not as a distant power to be persuaded, but as the living activity of your own consciousness. Now let us look at why effort, sincere, devoted, dedicated effort, actually blocks the very grace we long to experience. This is one of the deepest revelations of the spiritual life, and until it is understood, a student can spend years circling the same mountains, wondering why prayers seem unanswered and why peace appears elusive. The reason is simple. Effort is always the activity of the separated self. Effort says, I must accomplish this. I must bring harmony. I must overcome this condition. And the moment you take that position, you have unknowingly placed yourself outside of the infinite, believing there is you on one side and God on the other. In that very belief lies the obstruction. You see, God is not something separate from you. God is the very substance of your being. God is the life, the intelligence, the activity of your consciousness. So when the personal self attempts to reach God, it is like a wave trying to reach the ocean. The very act of striving affirms a separation that never existed. And in that affirmation, grace is obscured, not withheld, but hidden behind the veil of your own self-effort. Goldsmit discovered a profound spiritual law. Any attempt to use God for personal ends separates the seeker from the experience of God. You cannot use truth, because truth is not a tool, it is your identity. You cannot employ God to change conditions, because God is not a power operating upon something outside itself. God is the one power, the one presence, the one reality. The moment you try to harness this power for human improvement, you are no longer resting in the spiritual understanding of one, but have slipped back into the belief in two. Effort arises from fear and from the false assumption that the universe requires your intervention, but the infinite way teaches that nothing true needs your assistance. Harmony is never created, it is revealed. Supply is never manufactured, it is unfolded. Healing is never produced, it is recognized. These are spiritual principles, and they function only when the mind becomes still enough to let the invisible act. The invisible law of the spirit is this: where the personal self acts, grace is silent. Where the personal self is silent, grace acts. And so, when you cease striving, you are not becoming passive, you are stepping aside so that the divine activity, which has been present all along, may become visible in your experience. It is not your effort that heals, but your surrender, not your plans that prosper you, but your willingness to trust the unseen order of the universe, not your strength that carries you, but the realization that the infinite is the life that lives you. And as this becomes clear, you begin to understand why the great mystics have always taught that the highest spiritual work is not doing, but recognizing the presence, recognizing the one, recognizing that God is the only activity, and therefore there is nothing left for the personal self to accomplish. Now that we understand why effort obscures grace, we can begin to explore what life feels like when the personal self no longer carries the burden of directing, controlling, and managing existence. When the striving ceases and the inner ear opens to the activity of the Spirit, a new way of living begins, one that is marked by harmony, guidance, and quiet inner assurance. This is not the life you build. It is the life that unfolds through you when you make yourself an open avenue for the infinite. The first sign of this new way of life is that you begin to act from a center of peace rather than from fear. Decisions are no longer frantic reactions to circumstances. They arise gently from within, as though whispered by an intelligence deeper than your own. You find yourself responding to situations with clarity you did not cultivate, compassion you did not manufacture, wisdom you cannot claim as personal achievement. You recognize that something greater is living itself as you. Another sign is that problems lose their power to disturb you. This does not mean that appearances suddenly vanish, but your relationship to them changes completely. Instead of rushing into analysis, strategizing, or mental argument, you pause just long enough to remember that you are not a human being burdened with problems, but the transparency through which God expresses. In that pause, harmony begins to reveal itself without the slightest interference of personal thought. In this way of life, even the simplest moments become sacred. Washing a dish, speaking to a friend, answering an email, all of it becomes an opportunity to abide in the awareness that the infinite is the activity behind every gesture. You begin to sense that nothing is mundane and nothing is separate from the presence. Every task becomes an act of devotion, not because you perform it for God, but because you perform it with God as the living presence expressing itself. This daily life is not passive. It is deeply alive. It is alert, sensitive, responsive to the inner movement rather than the outer demand. You discover that you no longer must figure out your path. The path unfolds. You no longer must chase supply. Supply appears as needed. You no longer must manage relationships. Relationships begin to harmonize themselves when you meet every person from the consciousness of one. And as you walk in this new way, you notice something remarkable. Your effectiveness in the world increases, not because of greater effort, but because the source of all effectiveness is now functioning through you. The infinite way is not an escape from living. It is the deepest engagement with life carried out from the center of God's activity rather than the strain of the personal will. In this flowing, effortless unfoldment, you begin to see the truth of Goldsmith's statement. The secret of living is letting God live your life. And once this truth is felt, not merely understood intellectually, but felt in the quiet depths of your being, you will never again seek to return to the life of struggle. The taste of inner peace is enough to make striving impossible. For you have discovered a better way, the way of letting God be God in you. As you begin living from this inner stillness, without the burden of constant striving, something remarkable occurs. Life itself begins to reveal a harmony that was always present, but long concealed by fear, effort, and personal will. And the evidence of this surrender does not come through dramatic miracles or sudden outward changes. Though such things may happen, the true evidence appears quietly, gently, as if life were redeeming itself from within. The first and most unmistakable evidence is the disappearance of fear, not because conditions have changed, but because your sense of identity has changed. When you no longer see yourself as a vulnerable creature struggling in a chaotic universe, but as the expression of the infinite, fear loses its foundation. You discover a peace that does not depend on circumstances, and this peace becomes the atmosphere in which you live. Then you notice that relationships begin to soften. People who once seemed difficult no longer evoke the same reactions within you. You meet them not with personal judgment or memory, but with the recognition of the same presence that lives in you. And because you see differently, they respond differently, not by your manipulation, but by the silent influence of the consciousness you now embody. The world begins to meet you according to your realization of oneness. Another evidence is that solutions appear without struggle. A problem that once consumed your mind shows a way forward at the moment you release it into the silence. Supply that you once chased now flows naturally. Opportunities arise that you never planned. These are not coincidences. They are the outward signs of an inward shift. When you cease trying to control life, the divine order becomes free to manifest through the avenues prepared for it. Healing, too, begins to unfold, not necessarily as instantaneous transformation, though that is possible, but as the gradual revelation that the life within you has never been sick, never broken, never incomplete. The healing does not come because you worked on the condition. It comes because you stopped believing that the condition had power. Grace reveals what has always been true. The Spirit of God within you is whole, and therefore wholeness must appear in your experience. As this surrender deepens, you begin to realize that nothing in your outer world is separate from the activity of your inner being. Life becomes a mirror, reflecting your consciousness. When you abide in peace, peace appears around you. When you abide in quiet trust, the events of your life begin to move with quiet order. When you abide in the awareness of God's presence, you find that God's presence meets you in every place you walk. And so the evidence of surrender is not something you create, but something you witness. It is the dawning recognition that the universe is benevolent, that the infinite is trustworthy, and that harmony is the natural condition of life once the personal self steps aside. You begin to see that grace was never absent. It was only obstructed by the noise of striving. When surrender has taken root, life begins to redeem itself, not because you have changed the outer world, but because you have awakened to the inner presence that has always governed all things with perfect wisdom. And now, as we draw this class to a close, let us return to the essence of what has been revealed here. The entire spiritual life rests upon a single, simple recognition. God is the life of your being, and therefore there is nothing for the human self to accomplish. The Father's presence is already within you. The activity of spirit has never ceased. Harmony has never been absent. Yet the human mind, in its perpetual striving, has obscured this ever-present reality. The call of the infinite way is not a call to effort, to striving, or to achievement. It is a call to inner rest, the rest that comes when you relinquish the belief that you must make something happen and instead allow the divine activity to reveal itself. This rest is not inactivity. It is the cessation of mental noise that enables the still, small voice to be heard. And so I invite you now, gently and without pressure, to adopt a new inner attitude as you go forth from this moment. I will not attempt to direct God. I will be still and let God be God. This is the doorway to grace. This is the state of consciousness in which all good becomes visible. Do not attempt to practice this with strain or discipline. Simply pause throughout your day, even if only for a breath, and acknowledge the presence. Let the recognition arise. The Father within me is the one who performs every act. I need do nothing of myself, and you will discover that this simple turning within opens your awareness to a depth of peace you may not have known was possible. In that peace, Guidance will come not from your reasoning mind, but from the divine impulse that knows your path better than you ever could. In that peace, solutions will unfold not as the result of analysis, but as the natural activity of God. In that peace, you will discover your true identity, not a struggling mortal, but the transparency through which the infinite expresses its own perfection. And as this realization settles into your consciousness, you will find that life becomes the effortless outpouring of a presence that has always been yours. The world may continue its noise, but you will walk through it with quiet certainty. Circumstances may shift and change, but you will remain anchored in the awareness that the harmony of God governs all. You will live each day not as one who must struggle, but as one who has surrendered to the divine activity already at work. So let us leave here today with this simple prayer, not spoken with words, but felt in the depth of our being. Father, I release all striving. Reveal thy presence as the activity of my life. In that prayer, the whole spiritual path is contained. In that prayer, every answer is given before the question arises. In that prayer, the seeker becomes the instrument of God's living presence. Go in peace, not because peace is something you acquire, but because peace is what you are when the striving ceases and the infinite begins to shine without obstruction. The class is ended.